Welcome, everyone. We're diving deep today into church life, pastors, congregations, and the experience of dissent in 17th-century England. It's a mouthful, I know, but trust me, this book is amazing. It takes us right into the lives and practices of those who, well, let's just say they weren't exactly following the religious mainstream of their time.
It really is. And what I find so fascinating is how it goes beyond the usual stories of persecution and focuses on what daily life was like in these nonconformist communities. It's like stepping back in time and seeing how they actually functioned.
Right, it's not just about the big names and dramatic events. It's about the nitty-gritty, the everyday experiences of these churches, how they governed themselves, how they dealt with disagreements, how they really lived their faith.
Exactly. The editors, Michael Davies, Ann Denan Page, and Joel Halcombe, make a really strong case for studying church life to understand dissent. They argue that these churches weren't just reacting to pressure from the outside, they were creating their own systems of belief and practice.
And they did that by relying on some pretty incredible sources. Church books, those handwritten records from back then, give us an amazing glimpse into the lives of ordinary people. It's mind-blowing that we can access these intimate details from centuries ago.
Oh, absolutely. These records are a treasure trove. They document everything from church meetings and disciplinary actions to debates about theology and, as you mentioned earlier, even a little bit of gossip.
Okay, I admit, the gossip does make it even more interesting. But seriously, these records help us see dissent on a communal level, not just as something individuals struggled with alone.
Exactly. And one thing that becomes really clear is that dissent wasn't just one thing. There was a huge variety of nonconformist groups, each with their own interpretation of Scripture and their own way of doing things.
The book does a great job of showing that diversity, doesn't it? It talks about how many of these groups rejected the traditional church hierarchies and went for a more egalitarian model based on voluntary membership.
Yeah, and that focus on voluntary membership led to the idea of visible saints. These were people who could demonstrate their faith through their actions and were considered worthy of being part of the community.
That idea of visible saints makes you think about women's roles in these communities, right? On the one hand, they were encouraged to participate, but on the other, they were still limited by the traditional views of the Bible.
It's a fascinating puzzle, and the book dives right into it. We see women actively involved in church life, attending meetings, speaking their minds, and even, in some cases, pushing back against those traditional gender roles.
And the book doesn't shy away from the controversy either. It talks about those lively debates over whether women should have a vote in church matters or be involved in making decisions. It's pretty amazing to see how these issues were already being discussed back in the 17th century.
It really challenges our assumptions about that time period, doesn't it? We tend to think of it as very strict, especially for women. But this book reveals a much more nuanced reality.
And speaking of challenging assumptions, there's that amazing essay by Kathleen Lynch. She writes about a separatist group renting a room in the Bishop of London's palace in 1647. Can you imagine? Holding a secret meeting right under the nose of the authorities.
It's a perfect example of how resourceful and adaptable these groups had to be to survive. And it shows how important place was to their experience. The choice of meeting location, whether hidden or public, could send a powerful message.
That makes me think about another important theme that comes up in the book: pastoral care. This idea seems to have been central to the Westminster Assembly, which was convened by Parliament to reform the Church of England.
It was. And what's interesting is the emphasis they put on the minister's role in addressing sin and its impact on individuals and society as a whole. They saw pastors as almost like spiritual doctors, skilled in diagnosing and treating the spiritual diseases of their congregations.
It's a powerful analogy.
Yeah,
And it raises all sorts of questions about the role of a minister. What about caring for the poor, for example? These are things that we still grapple with today.
absolutely. And speaking of ongoing debates, the book also digs into the concept of freedom of association, something that emerged during the political turmoil of the English Revolution. This idea that people have the right to choose their own church and form new religious groups was a radical departure from the traditional idea of a single established church.
And it's fascinating how this concept of freedom of association was tied to both divine mandate and individual rights. The book explores how those ideas were used to support this new form of religious liberty. It's a real challenge to the authority of the established church and paves the way for a much more diverse religious landscape.
It really shows how religion and politics were intertwined back then, and we see it play out in the debates about baptism and church membership, particularly among the independents.
It's so interesting, right, when we get into the nitty-gritty of how these nonconformist churches actually worked. Like, how did they handle things like order and discipline within their communities? This whole idea of church discipline really makes you think about the challenges of staying unified and upholding their beliefs.
It really does. It makes you wonder, like, what was it really like to belong to one of these churches? What were the rules? What happened if you didn't follow them? And thankfully, the book really digs into the details. It even tells us the reasons people gave for missing church services.
It's like we're getting a behind-the-scenes look at history. We see not just the ideals, but the real human side of these communities.
Absolutely. And the reasons for missing church were fascinating. Some were pretty understandable, like illness, which, was a much bigger deal back then than it is now.
Right, no popping a pill or running to the doctor for a quick fix. A simple cold could turn serious fast.
Exactly. And distance played a role too. Travel was so much harder then, so if you lived far away, getting to church regularly could be a real struggle, especially with bad weather or limited transportation.
It makes you appreciate how easy we have it nowadays. Just hop in the car or on the train. Imagine traveling for hours, even days, to get to a church meeting.
It puts our traffic complaints in perspective, right? But besides those practical reasons, the book also mentions something even more interesting. Some people stopped going because they were disillusioned with the church itself.
So it wasn't always external factors keeping them away. Sometimes it was a disconnect between their own spiritual needs and what the church was offering.
Exactly. Some people just drifted away. Maybe they found the rules too strict or the sermons boring, or maybe they didn't feel a sense of community or support.
It reminds us that these were voluntary communities. Maintaining that sense of belonging and purpose wasn't always easy.
Not at all. And of course, some people got in trouble for, well, let's just say exploring other spiritual options. Remember Thomas Jacob? He was reprimanded for attending a Quaker meeting.
Oh yeah, I remember that story. It shows how even within this world of dissent, there were still boundaries. You couldn't just believe anything you wanted.
Exactly. And the book talks about the different methods these churches used to enforce discipline. Remember those messengers who visited absent members? It was almost like a 17th-century version of a welfare check.
It's an interesting mix of care and control, isn't it? They wanted to make sure their members were okay, but they also wanted to reinforce the importance of following the rules.
Right. It shows how important community and accountability were to these churches. It wasn't enough to just show up on Sunday. You had to be an active participant and uphold their values.
And sometimes that meant public shaming, right? The book talks about cases where absent members were called out in front of everyone.
Yeah, public admonishment was seen as necessary to maintain order and show how seriously they took their commitments. Can you imagine that happening today?
It definitely makes those church meetings sound a lot more intense than what we're used to.
Yeah.
But what I find really fascinating is how these churches, even with all their rules and regulations, were still able to adapt and change over time.
That's a key point. They weren't stuck in their ways. They were constantly responding to the world around them. And there's no better example of that than Ebenezer Chandler and the Bedford congregation.
Ah, yes. The successor to John Bunyan, the author of Pilgrim's Progress. It must have been tough following in his footsteps, especially with their different leadership styles.
You can say that again. Bunyan was charismatic, with a more personal touch. Chandler was more about structure and formality. It's amazing how he led the church during this period of religious toleration, making changes that Bunyan might have opposed.
Like introducing infant baptism and psalm singing, which the book calls a move towards a Presbyterian-leaning Congregationalism.
Exactly. It shows how even within dissent, there were different ideas about what the right way to be a church was.
And those differences sometimes caused conflict, didn't they? The book mentions the controversy with Richard Davis, that dissenting minister accused of causing division.
That's right. Chandler was right in the thick of it. It shows that even in this small group of dissenters, there were still disagreements and struggles for power.
And different ideas about what liberty really meant within a religious community. Chandler's vision was quite different from Bunyan's, which was more inclusive.
Which leads us to a question that's still relevant today. How do we balance individual freedom with the needs and expectations of a community? These 17th-century dissenters grappled with it, and we're still grappling with it today.
Because it's not just about doing whatever you want, is it? It's about finding that sweet spot between personal expression and what's best for the group.
Exactly. And learning how these early nonconformist churches handled those tensions can teach us a lot. It can help us build communities that are inclusive while staying true to their core values.
It reminds us that the search for religious freedom is a journey, not a destination. It takes constant conversation, flexibility, and a willingness to listen to different viewpoints.
It does, and it's a journey that's both challenging and rewarding, pushing us to question our own beliefs and seek common ground despite our differences.
Looking back at all these different 17th century churches, it's obvious there wasn't just one kind of dissent. It's more like a giant mix of beliefs and practices, each group adding its own flavor to the religious landscape.
That's what's so captivating about this time period. You had everything from Presbyterians to Congregationalists, Baptists, Quakers, all challenging the established church in their own unique way.
It's like they were experimenting with religious expression, pushing the limits of what was considered acceptable, and in a way, paving the way for a more diverse society.
That's a great way to think about it. And even within those groups, there were divisions and arguments. Take the debate over baptism, for example. It really got to the core of what it meant to be part of these churches.
Right? It wasn't just about the theology of baptism itself. It was about who had the authority to perform it, who could receive it, and ultimately who was in and who was out of the church.
Exactly. And that takes us back to that tug of war between individual conscience and the group's expectations. If you believe only those who've consciously accepted the faith should be baptized, well, that changes how you welcome new members and define your community.
And it makes you wonder, how did they handle disagreements? Was there room for dissenting opinions even among dissenters?
Such a good question. The book offers some really interesting insights into how these communities dealt with internal conflicts. Sometimes it led to splits and new congregations forming, but sometimes they found ways to accommodate different views within the same church.
It speaks to the dynamic nature of these communities. They were always evolving, adjusting, and rethinking their beliefs and practices based on what was happening both inside and outside the church.
They were. And that process wasn't always peaceful or easy. There were power struggles, clashes over doctrine, and even cases where individuals were pushed out or punished for having unpopular opinions.
It reminds us that even when people share a common goal, they won't always see eye to eye. Finding ways to handle those differences, talk respectfully, and find some common ground is crucial for any community, religious or not.
Couldn't agree more. It takes empathy, humility, and really listening to those who see things differently.
And maybe a little bit of that same flexibility and resilience we see in those 17th century dissenters. They faced so much, from prejudice to outright persecution, yet they built vibrant communities and left a lasting mark on the fight for religious freedom.
Their story is incredibly inspiring. It shows that even when things are tough, you can stand by your beliefs, work for change, and make the world a better place.
And to do it all with a sense of community and a willingness to talk things through, even when you disagree. What a powerful reminder of our human need for meaning, belonging, and the freedom to live out our faith.
Absolutely. Well, I think this wraps up our deep dive into church life, pastors, congregations, and the experience of dissent in 17th century England.
What a fascinating journey it's been, full of surprises and so much to think about. But most importantly, it's given us a deeper understanding of this crucial period in history and what it means for how we view religious freedom and community today.
I couldn't have said it better myself. It's been a pleasure sharing this exploration with you.
And with you, our listeners. We hope this deep dive sparked your curiosity and inspired you to learn even more. Until next time, everyone.